Hey, welcome back. It's Sarah from Roadworthy. It's another weekly reads. I actually got a lot of reading done this week, which I'm not quite sure why. Maybe because I didn't really go anywhere this week, and my husband's out of town. So I think both things combined gave me a lot of time to be reading at home in the garden. I have big road trip coming up. So my youngest and I are going to be headed to Iowa. Oh, a whole week with a 19-year-old. It's kind of funny. But anyway, I'm plotting and scheming what to read. So that is taking up a lot of mental energy too. So that's been fun to talk with him about, where are we going to stop and, blah, blah, blah. So hopefully we will have some footage of some cool stops along the way. If I get internet access, of course. Oh, in the meantime, what have I read? So, I think I mentioned last week that I was just about done with Half a Lifelong Romance by Eileen Chang, and I did finish that audiobook. That is the love story between Shijun and Manzhen. They meet working in a factory in 1930s Shanghai. The Goodreads description of this book describes it as a beloved classic. It's kind of easy to see why. This is a classic, like boy meets girl, they fall in love, they fall out, What happens though is they do fall in love, and then just through a series of like near misses, misunderstandings, family pressures, they are sort of driven apart. I loved this book. Even though total classic storyline, even though you kind of know what's going to happen, even though I would say that there are parts of this book that kind of approach melodramatic, I loved it. Loved every second. It's love, it's loss, it's the burdens of family, it's societal expectations. There's, sophisticated city people and the country bumpkins. What she does so well is just these wonderful glimpses of everyday life. So gender roles, this is 1930s Shanghai, and so there are a lot of Western businesses in Shanghai at this time. So it's also, Western fashion being adopted by wealthy people, Western food, also a little bit of what traditions are falling by the wayside are now being deemed old-fashioned. So it's a real period of time in Shanghai where there's a lot of cultural flux, and I love that. I love those books that have just that everyday life. There's also just an incredibly strong sense of time and place. I'm just a sucker for books like that. And I think the other thing that Chang does so well is just the psychological insight to these characters. It feels like these are real people that are making these decisions, falling into these traps, making choices that maybe aren't the best, but you understand sort of the rationale. Absolutely loved this book. 5 stars, hands down. Loved it. And I was a little surprised because I read another one of her books. I want to say Little Reunions a couple years ago, and I think I only gave that 3 stars. But this was just a much more rich reading experience. Loved it. Then I was also reading Crip, Kinship by Shayda Kafai at the same time. And this is, the subtitle is Disability, Justice, and Art Activism of Sins Invalid. Sins Invalid, let me just read you Kafai's sentence of how she describes them. Since their creation in 2006, the San Francisco Bay Area-based Performance Project provides the community disability justice-informed evenings of multidisciplinary art, workshops, and educational trainings that center the knowledges of disabled, queer, gender nonconforming, and transgender art activists of color. I think that gives you a sense of Kafai's writing style. A little clunky chunky. It's a bit more academic than perhaps some readers would like. This is a really interesting book. Sins Invalid does a lot of work to do what they describe as decolonize themselves from the systems of oppression of our ableist, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal, consumerist culture. And so they have a lot of the art that they present, and a lot of workshops that they have for their community is around desirability, sexuality, lust, productivity, beauty. Some of what they focus on is creating what they call Crip-centered liberated zones. And these can be, physical places, events, venues, online communities, where their community members their needs are just met. They don't need to ask for things. The art that they produce, again, is really looking at beauty and sexuality and desirability, those kinds of things. And that was sort of one piece of their work, but then they have this whole sort of activism wing as well. And they do go into one of the reasons that this group was created was a feeling that because they're queer and perhaps gender nonconforming, they felt like they didn't quite fit into the disability rights community. And then because they're disabled, they didn't quite feel like they were fitting into the LGBTQ community either. And so that was part of the impetus for creating this group, was to really explore those intersectionalities. And that was a super interesting idea. And in their activism, they talk about this a little bit too. So one of the things that they were doing, so for example, disabled people are much more likely to be victims of sexual assault. And so one of the things that they were doing was working with a sexual assault victim support organization to try and educate them on the unique needs of disabled people, because they weren't really prepared or meeting the needs of disabled victims of sexual assault. Again, was an interesting example of some of the activism that they are involved in as well. So I haven't really done a lot of reading about disability, so this was an interesting book. Not sure this is the best place to start. But, if you've done any sort of social justice reading, you'll understand the concepts just fine in here. And again, I think Kafai's writing style, again, I mentioned it's a little chunky funky, again, makes this maybe not the best place to start. The crows. I actually got attacked this week by crows trying to water my plants. And I actually got like on the head and like on my back. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have a chunk of flesh ripped out. Anyway, so then I decided to read The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignacious Sancho. So I had heard about this from Katie at Books and Things, because this was longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize, which is a prize given for historical fiction. And I also heard it mentioned from Charlie at Charlie Book Reads and Simon from Savage Reads, both predicted it for the Booker Prize. And so I was thinking, I'm going to get ahead of the game and read this thing. This is about Charles Ignacious Sancho, who was born in 1729. And how this book is constructed is he is sharing letters and diary entries with his son to share sort of the highlights of his life. So I thought that structure was a little bit unusual, but then I sort of realized as I went along that it does allow him to just pull out the highlights and not perhaps those years in between where not much is happening. And it also, by using letters, it's able to share Anne, who is Sancho's wife. She stays in Barbados for a period of time, and so it allows the author to share a little bit about what life would have been in Barbados for both Anne and the slaves on these sugar plantations. So, the author clearly has done a ton of research into Sancho's life, and he definitely had a very interesting life. And it was interesting, he was an actor, he was a musician, he was a clerk, he was a duke's valet, he was a grocer. So it was super interesting to get snippets about all those different roles. But, to me, again, this was straight up genre fiction. I enjoyed it, but it was, I will say the positives about this book is it really presents London as a very multicultural community. So there were Arabs, Indians, Jews, blacks, whites, that would all be congregating in some of these working class, taverns. And I really appreciated that because I think a lot of times, when you're reading British classics, but also reading, other historical fiction about England, it's often very white. And so I think very often we think of, blacks entering England after World War II. And I really appreciated Paterson Joseph really calling out how vibrant and multicultural London has been for a very long time. The other thing I appreciate is Joseph writes this in a language that where he's attempting to reflect the language of the time period, which often, sometimes I'm reading historical fiction and I'm reading it and it's like totally contemporary language using to describe places or the conversations, and I think, wow, you could be hearing the same conversation today. You know, it doesn't feel remotely authentic. So I did appreciate Paterson Joseph's attempt to reflect the time period using language in the letters, in the descriptions, the language that did feel, authentic to the time. And so after that total genre experience, I felt like I was ready to take on something a little bit more literary, and I picked up Bilbao-New York-Bilbao from Kirmen Uribe. I love this cover. I love this little square shape of this book. I love this as a physical object, which is why I grabbed it. I had no idea really what it was about. It was on my TBR, my library list, and I don't know why. But this won the National Book Award in Spain in 2009. And it was translated by Elizabeth Macklin for Coffee House Press in 2022. Kirmen Uribe on a flight from Bilbao to New York City. And it's sort of, he's trying to think of a novel to write. And a lot of this is just like his interior thoughts as he's traveling along. Maybe a conversation that he has with a fellow passenger prompts him to think about his grandmother. Or at one point, he's reading a journal as research for his book. Diarist is describing their boat ride from Bilbao to New York City and describing the water birds. And that makes Uribe think of the cormorants at home in the Bay of Biscay. And then that prompts him to think about his great uncle who provided the word of that particular bird for a Basque language dictionary. So it's kind of how sort of one thought leads into another, leads into another, leads into another. And how these different memories sort of get strung together, sort of creating this web almost of little vignettes about his family, about his Basque community. Or you get just these wonderful little snippets and anecdotes about just everything. The mundane daily joys, the generosity of people in this small community who don't have a lot. There's definitely some Basque politics. So who's nationalists? Who's not? You see some of the dying traditions. So in Uribe, his grandfather's generation, everybody was a fisherman. But now in Uribe's generation, he's got one cousin who's a fisherman. So, you get little events that are miraculous, right? And then you get seeming miraculous events that turn out to have quite ordinary explanations. There's just all these wonderful little nuggets. And it was just poignant, delightful, vivid, bittersweet. It had it all. I really, really enjoyed this book, and it was not at all what I was expecting. So, again, pick up Bilbao-New York-Bilbao if you get a chance. It was delightful. Then I don't know what prompted me to pick up Saha by Nam-Joo, and this was translated by Jamie Chang. Nam-Joo, she also wrote Kim Ja-young, born 1982, that was all over Booktube a couple of years ago when it was published. That book had a huge splash, and so I was very surprised. This is her second book, and got translated in English right away. And I haven't heard a darn thing about it. This is a dystopian book. I am not a big sci-fi fantasy reader, but I do love a good dystopian book. I will say, unlike this was much more on the literary side of the street than the genre side of the street, I will say. And I think that might explain why this has a very low rating on Goodreads. I think it's under 3. I think also this is not told in a very straightforward, plot-heavy way. So let me step back and say this is about Saha, which is a neglected apartment complex in a place called Town. And Town is an island community that was purchased by a corporation 30 plus years ago. And in Town, the citizens are the ones that have valuable skills and assets. So your doctors, lawyers, teachers. And then you have a class of people who are called L2s, and they have enough skills and enough social standing where they're able to get a visa to be in Town for 2 years. Every 2 years they need to renew their visa. And then you have the residents of Saha, who are basically squatters in this derelict apartment building. No water, no electricity, nothing. And they end up working as unskilled laborers in sort of this underground economy as a way of surviving. In the plot unfolds, as some of the secrets behind Town start to become revealed. I won't say anything more, obviously, but I think, to me, what was interesting how this book is told is each chapter will sort of focus on, apartment 311. And so it'll be perhaps the generation that moved into apartment 311 on Saha, and how they came to have children, and then maybe the current day resident of Saha is those adult children. So again, you get these vignettes about the residents perhaps across generations, but then you're getting vignettes of different people in different apartments. And so that allows the author to sort of give you the history of Town and how it came to be, as well as sort of the current state of affairs in Town. And I thought it was great. I super enjoyed it. Little book, but there's a lot in here about obviously class, capitalism. There's quite a bit about bodily autonomy in here. A lot about sort of institutional and inherited poverty. So I thought it was interesting. I mean, there are some. This is not a perfect book, and I think some of the complaints that I read on Goodreads are legit. But again, I liked it. I thought the structure was different. Again, I just thought this was a little bit more literary than your straight up plot driven dystopian novel. So, you know, give it a whirl. Even if sci-fi fantasy or dystopian novels aren't quite for you, you may find this one a good gateway. All right, so that's what I read this week. Again, I've got a road trip coming up, so I'm doing a lot of planning and scheming about what I'm going to be taking on that trip and to read. So putting things on hold, doing that whole song and dance, hoping things come in at just the right time so I can download them on my Kindle, because I probably won't have good internet access to be able to download things. So, it's a whole thing planning for these road trips. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.